So what can you expect in a high inflation economy? As I said in the previous video, inflation is double digits in the UK, it's reaching double digits in the US, and I think it's around 5% in Israel, which isn't too bad. But what can you expect assuming there is sustained inflation over a long period of time, which often happens once inflation spikes like this? Well, you have this tug of war where increasing interest rates puts a lot of pain on people with mortgages with variable rates, and so there's one side that really doesn't want interest rates to go up, whilst anybody who's suffering from inflation and increased prices on food and general living costs should, if they're informed, want interest rates to rise, because that's pretty much the only way we know of to bring inflation down. So this you get this tug of war dynamic, and ultimately, if you want to avoid the sort of hyperinflation that Israel saw back in the 70s and other countries have seen, you want the side of the increasing interest rates side of that tug of war to win, because that's the only way you bring this persistent inflation down. But it requires a lot of strength and a lot of courage, and from the leadership of the central bank in that country, because they are fighting this tug of war. And what you saw in the 70s, 80s in the US was Paul Volcker, the head of the Federal Reserve in the US, saw it as his mission to bring inflation down, and ultimately ended up increasing interest rates to around 20%. So yeah, I mean, it's very, very difficult when inflation spikes like this. The reason why it sustains itself is that you go into a supermarket, you can see your food prices going up. So then you go to your employer and you say, well, I need more wages because I can't afford to buy the food that I used to be able to buy. And so that puts pressure up on salary increases. But then if salary increases, that feeds through to ultimately prices of the goods and services you're producing as an employee. So you get this like inflation spiral where it's like one step of increased inflation produces another step, which produces another step, which feeds back on that original step. And so inflation often sustains itself, or if there's no leadership of the central bank, it can go into these spirals and even higher inflation and worst case hyperinflation. So I think what you'll expect to see in these high inflation economies is everyone trying to pass the buck, everyone trying to pass the blame. Central banks will blame increasing inflation rates on the greed of capitalists. Politicians may blame central banks. There'll just be this whole blame game. Because ultimately there's going to be pain to go round, and that pain has been caused from the last decade or so of monetary policy. So yeah, it's not pretty, it's not fun. I suppose the only upside is that savers finally get a return after all this time, after their savings have been inflated away for over a decade. But yeah, it's not pretty, and it can be even more ugly if there isn't a courageous leadership of a central bank who basically says, my sole mission is to bring inflation down. We can't have persistent inflation in double digits for years. It's just too harmful for the economy, and it's creating, the higher inflation gets, the higher the inflationary pressures get. So yeah, hopefully there'll be a Paul Volcker on both sides of the Atlantic that emerge and try and bring some stability back to the UK-US economies, but there's a long way to go.